Hey ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Unit 9, Notes 3-2, Excluded Values and Factoring. So to start off with, we're going to do a little bit of a review of factoring. All right, so remember when you're factoring, that's the one where you set up the x. So you're going to multiply the first and the last term. So 1 times 5 is going to give you 5. So we're multiplying to 5 and adding to 6. Well, there's only two things that multiply to 5, and that's 5 and 1. So I'm going to write that, 5 and 1. Okay, so multiplying to 5, adding to 6. So now that I've done that, I want to take and I'm going to split up this 6x. So I keep the x squared the same, and then I'm going to write 6x as 5x plus 1x plus 5. And now I want to go ahead and factor by grouping. So there and there. Between x squared and 5x, you can factor out an x, and then you're left with x plus 5. Between 1x and 5, we can't factor anything else. We're just going to take out a 1, and that leaves us with x plus 5. So right there, your leftovers are matching, so I'm going to factor that on out of there. Okay, once I cross those off, I'm left with x plus 1. So that right there is fully factored form. I want you guys to go ahead and factor number 2 on your own. You're multiplying to a negative 18 and adding to a negative 7. So see if you can figure that one out. Let's take a look at this one, factoring and excluded values. To find the excluded value when there is a quadratic on the bottom, you have to factor. So similar to what we were doing yesterday, we want to know when the bottom is equal to 0 because we want to say, hey, the bottom's equal to 0. We're not going to account for those. Okay, so once you factor, that's where we're going to use the zero product property. You were using the zero product property, but it was already factored for you. Today, it's not going to be factored, and you have to actually go through that work. So let's take a look at what that's going to look like. Let's pull over these pretty balloons here. Okay, so let's start by looking at number 1. So the first thing we're going to do on number 1 is we're going to factor. So I'm going to multiply to 8 and add to negative 6. So I want to think, okay, things that multiply to 8, 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Well, 2 and 4 add up to 6. So I'm going to write out the bottom, splitting up that 6x as 2x plus 6x, oops, not 2x, plus 4x, there we go, plus 8. And now I'm going to factor that by grouping. So I put the first 2 in the group, second 2 in the group. Between x squared and 2x, I can only take out an x, and then I'm left with x plus 2. In the second group, I'll take out a 4, and again, I'm left with x plus 2. So these two right here are matching, so I can go ahead and factor those out. And then left over after that is x plus 4. Now, this is kind of what it looks like yesterday. So this is the equivalent of writing x minus 5 divided by x plus 2, x plus 4. So again, for today, we're just focusing on the bottom part of the fraction. We'll worry about the top and the fraction as a whole starting tomorrow. So once we have it factored, remember what excluded value is. Excluded value is that we can't have the bottom equal to 0. So then we set the bottom equal to 0 to see what values make it 0 so we can say, hey, we're taking those and throwing them out. So when you use the zero product property, you take each factor and set it equal to 0. So x plus 2 is equal to 0, x plus 4 is equal to 0. So you're going to subtract 2 from both sides, and here you get x is equal to negative 2. Here you're going to subtract 4 from both sides, and you get that x is equal to negative 4. So these are my excluded values, so I do want you to write EV. And when you write EV, put that little line through the equal sign. That means that it cannot be equal to those values. Okay? Let's take a look at number 2. So really your final answer for this one is this guy right here, that EV, x cannot equal negative 2 or negative 4 for your excluded values. So now factoring for number 2. Setting up our x, we're multiplying to 6 and adding to negative 5. Well, here we have a positive product and a negative sum, which means we have two negative products. That's the only way we can get a positive product and a negative sum. Okay, so we're going to use negative 3 and negative 2. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to split up negative 5x as negative 3x minus 2x plus 6. So now I want to factor that by grouping. Between x squared and 3x, I can take out an x, and then I get x minus 3. And then here, that negative sign in the middle, I'm going to pull out a negative 2, and then we get x minus 3. So when you take out a negative, that changes the signs of both things that follow. So here I have x minus 3 and x minus 3. Those are matching, so I pull those out. And once I take that out, left over, I have x minus 2. So now we want to go about finding the excluded value. Okay, so we're going to take this guy right here and we're going to say, hey, that's equal to 0. So I'm going to take each of those factors and set them equal to 0. X minus 3 is equal to 0. X minus 2 is equal to 0. So here we're going to add 3 to both sides, and we get that x is equal to 3. Here we're going to add 2 to both sides, and we get that x is equal to 2. Okay, but oops, we don't want to write that as our final answer quite yet. Remember, we want to account for these as excluded values. Okay, so that means that x cannot be equal to those two, and I do want you writing that EV. Okay, so make sure you're writing that EV. All right, next, let's take a look at number 3, and then I'm going to have you guys do number 4. So for number 3, again, we want to factor that bottom. So let's go ahead and do that. What I want you guys to do is, why don't you just pause the video really quick and get the bottom of number 3 factored. Okay, so when you factor that, you end up getting x minus 8 times x minus 2, and we're going to set both of those equal to 0. So now x minus 8 is equal to 0, and x minus 2 is equal to 0. So here we're going to add 8 to both sides, and we get that x is equal to 8. Here we're going to add 2 to both sides, and we get that x is equal to 2. But remember, those are our excluded values. Those represent when it's equal to 0. So if we're going to label it as an excluded value, then we don't want x to be 8, and we don't want x to be 2. All right. Okay. So I'm going to have you guys try number 4 on your own. So factor the bottom, and then set each of those factors equal to 0 using the zero product property. Next, so let's talk about when factors cancel out, what can I do with the excluded values? So let's say, for example, you have x plus 4 on the top and you have x plus 4 on the bottom. Well, if that's the case, you can cancel them out. Okay, and you can get a nice, pretty, rational expression. That's what we're going to be working on more tomorrow. However, here's the deal. When you find the excluded value, you have to start with the excluded value at the beginning. So you need to figure out what your excluded values are before you cancel things out. So that's going to be really important coming up here. So it has to be before you start canceling things out. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let's start first with number 5. Okay, so for number 5, we're going to first factor out the bottom. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's factor that out. So we're multiplying to 2, adding to 3, which means I have 2 and 1. So I'm going to go ahead and factor that. Plus 2x plus 1x plus 2. And now we're going to factor that by grouping. Make 2 groups. Between x squared and 2x, you can take out an x. And then you're left with x plus 2. Between 1x and 2, you can't take anything out, so we're just going to take out a 1. So here I'm left with x plus 2. And then when I get rid of that, I'm left with x plus 1. Okay, so now before I do any simplifying, I want to figure out what my excluded values are. So I'm going to set both of those equal to 0. So for the first equation, when I subtract 2 from both sides, I end up getting x is equal to negative 2. Subtract 1 from both sides, and I get that x is equal to a negative 1. Now, if we were to write this out with our factored form, it would look a little bit like this. We would have x plus 2 over x plus 2 times x plus 1. So what I wanted to point out to you guys is these two factors, this one and this one, can cancel each other out. And that's more of what we're looking at tomorrow, but let's just practice it. So when they cancel out, I'm left with 1 on the top, and on the bottom is just x plus 1. Okay, now we did find our excluded values, which is the main purpose of the problem. Remember to put the slash through it. So what I'm looking for is that you write the excluded values and then you simplify that down. For most of these today, you're going to end up with 1 on top, and then you're going to have a factor left on the bottom. Let's take a look at number 6. Let's factor that out. So we're multiplying to negative 35 and adding to 2. So we're going to have a positive and a negative product. So think of things that multiply to 35. What I come up with is positive 7 and negative 5. So let's go ahead and factor that one out. So we have x squared plus 7x minus 5x minus 35. And now we're going to factor that by grouping. So between x squared and 7x, you can only take out an x, and then you're left with x plus 7. Notice that negative sign in the middle. So when we take out a GCF, it's going to be a minus sign. And we're taking out a negative 5, so that's going to change the signs of everything. And again, we're left with x plus 7. So those, we have x plus 7. And then left after that is x minus 5. Now we're going to set both of those equal to 0. So we get x plus 7 is equal to 0, and x minus, minus 5 is equal to 0. So now you'd go through and solve each of those equations. And when you do that, you get that your excluded value is that x cannot be negative 7 or positive 5. So that's a start for our excluded value. If we notice up here, we would basically have x plus 7 over x plus 7 times x plus 5. So those x plus 7s are going to cancel. So I'm just going to erase quickly so I can write what that would give us. Okay, so then when those cancel out, we're going to have that 1 on top, and left underneath is x plus 5. Okay, all right, moving forward. Okay, let's take a look next at these next ones. Let's take a look at number 7. So what I want you guys to do is we're going to pause the video and factor number 7. So go ahead and pause the video and factor number 7. So now we want to go ahead and calculate those excluded values. So we're going to set each of those factors equal to 0. So x plus 12 is equal to 0. X plus 1 is equal to 0. Subtract 12 from both sides on this one and you get negative 12. Subtract 1 from both sides on this one and you get negative 1. So your excluded value is that x cannot be negative 12 or negative 1. So that's your final answer for that one. Let's go through and do a little bit of simplifying. So once we factored that out, we ended up with x minus 3 on top. Then we had x plus 12, x plus 1. Well, none of our factors overlap, so we can't do any canceling out. So we're just going to leave that as is. And when you get to Algebra 2, you're going to learn a little bit more about this stuff. This is just kind of prep work for that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to have you guys try number 8 on your own. So factor the bottom. Most likely you won't be able to cancel out any factors, and make sure your denominator, you use the zero product property to get your excluded values before you cancel anything out. Let's take a look at number 9 here on together. Whoops. Okay, taking a look at number 9, let's go ahead and figure that out. So what we're going to do first is factor. We have negative 40 and negative 6. So we have to have a positive and a negative, factor. So I'm going to use negative 10 and positive 4. Again, if you're still struggling to see when to use what, go ahead and use a multiplication chart. So finish factoring that for me. So now again, we want to set both of those equal to 0. So we have x minus 10 is equal to 0, x plus 4 is equal to 0. So let's go ahead and we're going to add 10 to both sides on this one. So we get x is equal to 10. Subtract 4 from both sides on this one, and you get that x is equal to negative 4. So my excluded values are that x cannot be 10 or negative 4. Okay, because that's what's going to make my denominator 0. Now let's go simplify this guy a little bit. So we have x minus 10 on the top. Then on the bottom, we have x minus 10, x plus 4. So both of those cancel out. Notice that I'm keeping x plus 4 on the bottom. It was on the bottom of this factor, so I put the 1 on top, and the x plus 4 is going to go on the bottom. So I want you guys to go ahead and do number 10 on your own. Factor this out. You will have a factor that overlaps, so I want you to cross it off. Your leftover factor for today is going to be on the bottom, and you're going to have 1 on top. So once you're done, bring up your completed note sheet, and I will hand you a copy of the homework. Thanks for listening.